I never expected to start over at 70. I thought the hardest years of my life were behind me, the years I spent caring for my husband as his health slowly faded. 15 years of lifting him, feeding him, comforting him, praying beside him, 15 years of giving every piece of myself to a man I loved more than I ever loved anyone. I wasn't perfect, but I was there. Every holiday, every doctor visit, every long night when he couldn't sleep and just needed a hand to hold. But the strange thing about grief is that it doesn't always come from death. Sometimes it comes from the living. My grief arrived the moment his children who hadn't visited in a decade, walked into the funeral home like they owned the place and treated me like a stranger. And that was only the beginning of what they took from me. I was 55 the day I met my husband, and if I'm being honest, I didn't expect to fall in love at that age. I wasn't looking for anything. I had lived a simple life, worked my years as a school librarian, grew used to my own routines, and made peace with the idea that some chapters just stay unwritten. I had been divorced for a long time by then, and the idea of starting over felt like something for younger people. But life has this funny way of handing you something unexpected right when you've stopped expecting anything at all. His name was Charles. He walked into my life with the quiet confidence of someone who had lived enough years to understand the value of slow conversation. We met at a community book club of all places. I remember he was wearing this deep blue sweater that made his eyes look kinder, almost warmer than the rest of the room. He sat beside me, asked what I was reading, and listened, really listened, to my answer. I hadn't had someone do that in a long, long time. We went from strangers to comfortable companions so naturally that I didn't notice the shift until it was already happening. He called every evening just to say goodnight. He left small notes in my mailbox with poems or encouraging words. Sometimes he'd bring me fresh peaches from a roadside stand, smiling like he had found something special to share. It wasn't dramatic or rushed. It was slow, gentle, and sweet, like a warm breeze settling into your home. I fell in love without realizing I was falling. But not long after we married, maybe 2 years in, the changes started. Little things at first. He'd get tired walking up the driveway, or he'd forget where he put his keys, even though he'd always been organized. One day, he brushed off a tremor in his hand as just getting older, but I saw the fear flicker in his eyes before he tried to smile it away. The doctors were kind, but their words weren't. Early signs, they said. Progressive, they said. Degenerative. Words that drain the room of oxygen. I remember driving home that day, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Charles sat beside me, staring out the window in silence. I didn't know what the future would look like. I only knew one thing. I wasn't going to abandon him. Not then, not ever. He had 3 adult children, grown, busy, scattered around different states. They were polite to me, at least in the beginning. His daughter, Lacey, even brought me flowers once. For a little while, I thought we'd all find our rhythm as one blended family. But as his illness grew more complicated, their calls grew shorter. Then the visits grew further apart. Then the excuses became more frequent. I'm slammed at work. The kids have a tournament. We'll try next month. Next month never came. At first, I didn't judge them. They had their own lives, their own responsibilities, their own children to raise. I tried to give them the benefit of the doubt. I told myself that this was just how families drift sometimes. But as Charles got worse, their distance felt less like a drift and more like a disappearing act. I became his anchor, his caretaker, his comfort, his connection to the world. Our days fell into a rhythm. Early mornings were the hardest for him, so I'd help him sit up slowly, wrap a blanket around his shoulders, and ease him into his recliner. I learned how to manage his medications, how to help him bathe with dignity, how to be gentle even on days when nothing felt gentle. There were days when he didn't remember the name of the street we lived on or the date or what day of the week it was. But he always remembered me. His eyes would soften and he'd say, "There you are," like I was the one thing he could still hold on to in the fog. I didn't sleep much during those years. Even when I lay down, my mind stayed half awake, waiting to hear him call my name or shuffle toward the hallway. He fell once, early on in the illness, and after that I kept the bedroom door cracked so I could hear every sound. I slept lightly, like a mother with a newborn, always listening. People used to tell me I was strong. They'd say things like, "I don't know how you do it," or "You're a saint for staying by his side." I never liked those comments. Love isn't sainthood. It's a choice, yes, but once you choose someone, you stay. At least, that's how I was raised. That's what marriage meant to me. His children didn't seem to feel the same way. Every holiday, every birthday, every doctor's update, I sent messages, left voicemails, even tried writing long emails explaining his condition. Sometimes I'd get a short reply. Sometimes nothing at all. I tried not to let it bother me, but it did. Not because I wanted praise or help. I just wanted him to feel like his children still cared. There was one Thanksgiving I'll never forget. Charles was having a good day, one of the rare ones. He was alert, smiling, making little jokes about how dry the turkey looked on the cooking show. I asked him if he wanted to call his kids, maybe FaceTime since they couldn't come. He paused, his hand resting on the arm of his chair. "Don't bother them," he said softly. "They're busy." But I saw the sadness in his eyes, the disappointment he tried to swallow. I knew he missed them. I knew he missed being someone they leaned on. Illness had taken his independence, and now loneliness was taking the rest. As months turned to years, our world grew smaller. We didn't go out much anymore. The house became our universe, his recliner, the kitchen table where I'd feed him soup, the bedroom where I'd help him into bed. Sometimes we'd sit by the window and watch the neighborhood kids ride their bikes. Sometimes we'd listen to old records, letting Sinatra fill the silence between us. There were tender moments, more than people might imagine. He'd squeeze my hand when he was scared. He'd whisper "thank you" when he was too tired to speak full sentences. On his better days, he'd ask me to read to him from the books we first bonded over. I'd sit beside him, the way you might sit with someone you love more deeply than words can explain, and I'd read until he dozed off. Those years were heavy, yes, but they were also full of something I can only describe as sacred. Caring for someone at their most vulnerable strips away everything unimportant. What remains is love in its purest, simplest form. And yet, the more I cared, the less his children called. Sometimes I wondered if they thought I was exaggerating his condition. Other times, I'd catch a tone in their voices, skeptical, distant. They asked fewer questions about how he was doing and more about practical things: bills, accounts, paperwork. Always the practical things, never the personal ones. I kept them updated anyway. I thought it was the right thing to do. I thought it mattered. But I didn't realize how deeply my devotion and their absence was planting the seeds for a storm I couldn't see coming. Because when someone hasn't been around to witness the hard years, they're quick to rewrite the history of them. And that rewriting wouldn't begin until the day he took his last breath, quietly, with my hand resting in his, after 15 years of shared struggle and quiet love. I didn't know then that grief was about to take a different shape. One that came with voices raised, fingers pointed, and memories twisted into something unrecognizable. I didn't know that everything I had done, every sleepless night, every sacrifice, every moment of care, would be questioned, dismissed, and eventually used against me. I didn't know that the battle was just beginning. But it started the moment the phone rang on the day he passed, and I heard a voice on the other end, one of his children, sound more irritated than heartbroken, asking for details I wasn't ready to give. And in that moment, standing in my quiet kitchen with a pot of tea still steaming on the stove, I felt something shift inside me. Not fear, not anger, something colder. A realization that I was about to face a kind of grief no one prepares you for. And that realization marked the beginning of a story I never wanted to tell. After Charles's diagnosis settled into something real, something we couldn't wish away or pray out of. We fell into a life that felt smaller than anything I'd ever known. Our days circled around medication schedules, doctor visits, quiet meals, and long evenings where I tried to keep him comfortable while pretending everything was normal. I didn't let myself feel the weight of it at first. I told myself that other people had it worse, that love demanded sacrifice, that loneliness was just a part of caregiving. But some nights, when the house grew too still and Charles drifted off to sleep in his chair, I'd find myself turning the TV volume low and staring at the blank wall across from me. It felt like the silence inside the house had a heartbeat of its own. And in that silence, I felt abandoned, not by Charles, but by the world around us. Still, I didn't give up on trying to reach out to his children. I believed, deep down, that blood meant something. That kids, even grown ones, find their way home eventually, especially when a parent is sick. So I made it easy for them. I called often. I sent updates. I tried not to overwhelm them with too much detail, but I made sure they knew enough to understand the seriousness of their father's condition. Most of the time, all I got back were quick messages. Half sentences. Thanks. We'll see how the schedule looks. Busy week. Let us know if anything major changes. Anything major changes. I'd read those words and feel something twist inside me. What counted as major? The way he sometimes forgot if he'd eaten? The way he'd wake up disoriented? The new medication that made him weak for days? Should I catalog every fall, every long night sitting by his bedside waiting for his breathing to even out? I didn't want to be a burden. I didn't want them to think I was complaining. I just wanted them to care. The holidays were the hardest. I'd cook small meals, nothing extravagant, just old recipes Charles used to love, and I'd invite them weeks in advance. I'd tell them in gentle, hopeful words that their dad missed them, that he talked about them often on his good days. And every time, I'd wait for the same answers. We'll try. We're not sure yet. We'll let you know. They never let me know. The first Thanksgiving they skipped, I told myself not to take it personally. People get busy. Life gets in the way. Kids have sports and jobs and families of their own. So I set 2 plates instead of 5. We ate quietly. The only sound the soft clinking of silverware on ceramic. Halfway through the meal, I looked over at Charles. He wasn't angry. He wasn't sad. He just looked resigned. Like he expected it. That hurt more than anything. Then came Christmas. I decorated the house the way I always had. Little white lights around the staircase, a small wreath on the door, the same ceramic angel for the table. Charles helped me as much as he could, which wasn't much that year, but he insisted on handing me ornaments one by one. His hands shook, but his eyes were bright with effort. The kids promised they would try harder that time. They said they'd probably stop by. I kept checking the window, every hour, as the sun dipped and the lights inside grew brighter. Every time a car passed, my heart jumped. I even set out their favorite cookies just in case. They didn't show. No call. No text. Just a long night that settled into the quiet kind of disappointment. The kind you don't tell anybody about because it feels too embarrassing to admit you expected more. By New Year's, I stopped sending long invitations. I sent polite, short messages. I told them they were welcome. I told them I was making simple meals. I told them the door was open if they wanted to come. They never did. And I wondered what I had done wrong. Maybe they thought I was holding their father too close. Maybe they believed I exaggerated his condition for sympathy. Maybe, in the deepest corners of their minds, they saw me as someone who had replaced their mother, someone who didn't deserve their trust. But what stung wasn't the distance. It was the resentment that started slipping through their voices in the rare moments they called. They asked questions with sharp edges. Are you sure he needs that medication? Why does he always sleep when we call? You said he was doing better last month. What changed? He sounded confused. Are you keeping us in the loop? We would have helped earlier if you told us everything. I wanted to scream sometimes. I wanted to say, Where were you when he needed you? Where were you when I needed support? But I didn't. I always kept my voice steady, gentle. I never wanted them to think I was attacking them. Inside, though, their tone left bruises. There were moments, small ones, that felt like glimpses into what was coming. When his youngest son asked casually about the life insurance policy. When his daughter joked about how at least the house is almost paid off. When one of them said, as lightly as flipping a page, that if anything happened, they'd be there to help sort things out. Help. Sort things out. Words that sat wrong in my stomach. Maybe they didn't mean anything malicious then. Maybe they were just careless, not cruel. But once the resentment crept in, their distance grew even wider. They called less. They visited almost never. They asked fewer questions about their father and more about logistics. I tried to ignore it. I didn't want to see it. I wanted to believe they still loved him. But love shows up. Love isn't quiet when someone you care about is slipping away. Love doesn't wait for convenience. Love doesn't call twice a year and declare itself involved. Still, every time the phone rang and their name popped up on the screen, I'd answer immediately. Not because I craved their approval, but because Charles still lit up at the sound of their voices. He'd say their names softly, like a prayer he wasn't sure he deserved to make. And every time they ended the call quickly, his shoulders slumped the way a child's does when the toy they wanted slips off the shelf. I held him through every disappointment. I held us both. As his illness progressed, my world narrowed. Bills piled up. Insurance forms became puzzles I couldn't always solve. The house kept aging, leaky faucets, creaking steps, peeling paint, and I fixed what I could when I could. The nights got longer. The fear got heavier. Loneliness stopped being something I felt occasionally and started being something that wrapped around me like a second skin. One evening, after a rough day, when Charles had trouble remembering how to get from the bedroom to the kitchen, I sat on the edge of the bathtub crying quietly. Not loud sobs, just tired tears rolling down my face. Tears that came from exhaustion, from worry, from feeling invisible. I never let him see me cry. He needed strength, not sadness. But that night, when I stepped out of the bathroom, he was sitting in the hallway waiting for me, his hand trembling on the railing. "I heard you," he whispered. "Come here." I knelt beside him, and he rested his forehead against mine, his breathing slow and warm. "I'm sorry," he murmured, voice breaking. "I didn't mean to give you this life." I held his face gently. "You didn't give me anything. We're in this together. I'm right where I want to be." He shook his head slightly. "Then why won't they come?" There it was. The question he had been holding back for years. I felt something inside me crack, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, like the sound of ice thinning under weight. "I don't know," I whispered. But I did know. Somewhere along the way, his children decided I wasn't one of them. They decided I was an outsider. A stand-in. Someone who would do the work, so they didn't have to. Someone convenient. And convenience is a dangerous kind of forgetfulness. Still, I kept trying. I kept calling, texting, reaching out. I didn't want bitterness to take root. I believed kindness could soften even the hardest distances. But every unanswered message, every clipped conversation, every suggestion that I was just the stepmother carved deeper lines in the story that was unfolding, even though I didn't recognize the shape of it yet. I didn't know then that these hints, these small resentments, these dismissive tones, these glimpses of entitlement, were setting the stage for something much larger. Something that would hit me the moment Charles took his last breath. I didn't know that the loneliness I felt during his illness was only the beginning. Because when grief enters a house, it doesn't always come alone. Sometimes it brings people who haven't been there in years. Sometimes it brings the kind of questions you never expect to answer. And sometimes it brings a storm, one that would break over my head the morning after he died. A storm that would show me exactly how far his children were willing to go, and how easily they could erase me from the story of the man I cared for with every piece of myself. When Charles took his final breath, the world around me didn't stop the way I thought it would. The room didn't shake. The lights didn't flicker. There was no grand moment where heaven opened up and said, "We're here to take him home." No, that was quiet, soft, almost gentle. He exhaled, his fingers relaxed around mine, and something inside me felt both shattered and strangely peaceful. I sat there for a long time, holding his hand, my thumb tracing the same spot I'd rubbed during his last few hours. I whispered things I never had the courage to say out loud before: how proud I was of him, how honored I was to be the one beside him, how much I wished his children had been here too. But they weren't. It was just me. And that should have told me something about the days that were coming. But grief fogs the mind. It softens your instincts. It makes you believe people will rise to the moment, even when they've shown you time and time again who they are. I spent the next 2 days planning a small, dignified funeral the way Charles would have wanted. Nothing flashy, nothing drawn out. Just a quiet ceremony, soft music, a simple wooden casket, and a few words spoken with sincerity. I didn't have the energy for anything more. Grief had settled on my chest like a heavy coat, and I wore it everywhere I went. When I called his children to let them know, their voices suddenly changed. Gone was the cold distance. Gone was the clipped tone. Gone was the years-long absence. They sounded emotional. Too emotional. Almost rehearsed. But I didn't judge. Not then. I told myself grief affects people differently. Maybe this was their moment to finally show they cared. Maybe this was the step that would bring us all closer. Maybe I would not have to stand alone through this. I was wrong. The morning of the funeral felt like walking through thick, invisible air. I dressed in a navy dress Charles always liked, simple, soft, with a small pearl pin he gave me on our 10th anniversary. I pinned it gently at my collarbone, whispering, "You're coming with me." When I arrived at the church, the funeral home staff helped set everything up: the framed photo of Charles, the guest book, the flowers I chose carefully to reflect his quiet personality. White lilies, a small spray of greenery, a ribbon with his name. Then the doors opened. His children walked in like a parade. 5 of them in total, his eldest son leading the group, the others close behind. Faces full of dramatic grief, shoulders heavy with exaggerated sorrow, as if they were performing for an audience that wasn't there. They hadn't seen their father in months. Some of them hadn't visited in years. But now, suddenly, they were the grieving children of the man they barely called. I stood by the front pew, hands folded, ready to welcome them despite everything. But they didn't come to me. They walked right past me, as if I were part of the furniture. His eldest son didn't even look at me. His daughter brushed my arm lightly, not to comfort me, but to push past me. Another whispered something under his breath, then shook his head with theatrical sadness. I tried to tell myself not to take it personally. Maybe they were overwhelmed. Maybe they needed space. Maybe this was grief, raw and messy. But then came the seating. The eldest son turned to the funeral director and said, "Family sits in the first row. We'll take it." I stepped forward gently. Actually, He didn't let me finish. "We are his children," he said louder, as if trying to make a point. "We'll sit up front." The funeral director looked confused but didn't challenge them. I stood there, feeling like someone had emptied me out from the inside. I wasn't asking for a parade. I wasn't trying to dominate their space. I just wanted a seat by the man I gave 15 years of my life to. I wanted to sit where a wife sits. But they didn't see me as a wife. They saw me as an outsider. A placeholder. Someone who belonged on the edge of the room, not the front of it. I ended up sitting in the second row, still close but not close enough. I kept my eyes on Charles's picture to keep the tears from forming in places I didn't want them to. The service began, and the pastor gave a gentle speech about love, family, and faith. I clung to every word like it was a rope holding me steady. But behind me, I could hear whispering. Soft at first, then louder, then unmistakable. That's not the picture we wanted. Why didn't she call us sooner? She probably didn't tell us how bad it was. Dad would have liked something nicer. She rushed all this. It doesn't look respectful. Their whispers felt like tiny knives, each one sharper than the last. I sat still, hands folded in my lap, trying not to crumble. When it came time to share memories, I planned to stand up and say a few quiet words. Charles wasn't a man who loved speeches, but I wanted to give him something gentle, something honest. But before I even stood, his eldest daughter popped up from the front row. She walked to the podium like she owned the entire moment and began speaking about her father with a voice full of emotion. Big, dramatic, trembling emotion. She talked about childhood summers, about fishing trips, about jokes she claimed he always told. Some of it was true. Some of it was exaggerated. Much of it was sanitized. What she didn't mention were the years she didn't visit. What she didn't mention were the birthdays she skipped. The arguments. The distance. The silence. But funerals bring out selective memory, I suppose. After she finished, I waited for a chance to speak, but immediately his sons stood up to share their stories too. None of them mentioned me. None of them acknowledged the woman who bathed their father when he couldn't stand, who fed him when he forgot how to hold a fork, who stayed up through long nights, keeping him calm as confusion crept into his mind. They erased me from the story of his life, and the people in the pews believed them. When the pastor asked if anyone else wanted to speak, I raised a hand. Just slightly. Not high. Not demanding attention. Just enough to show I had something to say. But his children stood first, blocking the aisle, blocking sight lines, blocking me, intentionally or not, I don't know. The moment slipped away from me. After the service, strangers I'd never met hugged Charles's children, telling them how sorry they were for their loss. Some even said, "Your father was lucky to have you." And the kids nodded solemnly, accepting the praise like they had spent years at his bedside. No one hugged me. No one even looked at me long enough to notice the pain written across my face. I went to sign the paperwork with a funeral home director, but before I could finish, the eldest son approached. "Can we talk about Dad's things?" he asked bluntly. Not. "How are you holding up?" Not. "Do you need anything?" Not. "Thank you for taking care of him." No. Dad's things. I swallowed hard. "We can talk later. Today is his day." He crossed his arms. "Today is about family decisions." I looked at him, really looked at him, and realized something cold and heavy. This wasn't grief. This wasn't love. This wasn't even guilt. This was possession. They weren't mourning their father. They were repositioning themselves in his absence, as if his death created an opening they were eager to fill. His daughter stepped closer. "We just want to make sure everything is handled properly." Properly. A word people use when they want control, without saying they want control. I stepped back. I didn't trust my voice. Not in that moment. Not with tears burning behind my eyes and a lump in my throat so large I could hardly breathe. They gathered around the funeral director, circling him like a pack trying to claim territory. I walked outside for air. The sky was gray, heavy with clouds, and the wind felt colder than it should have for that time of year. I stood alone near the church steps, wrapping my arms around myself the way Charles used to hold me on cold mornings. His warmth was gone, and in its place was a loneliness so deep it felt like it could swallow me whole. They didn't see me. Not in life. Not in sickness. Not at the funeral. And certainly not now. But even in that hollow moment, something inside me stirred, small, faint, but real. A voice. A boundary. A truth forming quietly inside the grief. They could erase me from the front row. They could erase me from the speeches. They could erase me from their stories, but they could not erase what I had lived. And they could not erase what was coming next. I thought the worst part of losing Charles would be the funeral, the empty chair beside me, the sound of his name being spoken in past tense, the way his children pretended to be the grieving center of his world. I thought that would be my breaking point. But grief has a way of showing you new levels of pain you didn't know existed. It was 3 days after the funeral when I heard the knock. Sharp. Fast. Not the knock of someone bringing comfort, the knock of someone bringing trouble. When I opened the door, all 5 of his children were standing on my porch. None of them had called. None of them had asked if I needed anything. They simply arrived, their faces stiff with determination, as if they were here to conduct business, not mourn a man they barely visited. "Hi," I said softly, still exhausted from the service, still waking up every morning expecting to hear Charles calling my name. His eldest son didn't say hello. He walked past me the instant I stepped aside. "We're here to go through Dad's things," he said, like a command. I froze for a moment. "Through his things?" "Yes," his daughter replied, already pulling on thin gloves like she was preparing for evidence collection. "We need to get everything sorted." My stomach tightened. I wasn't ready. I wasn't emotionally prepared. I hadn't even touched Charles's side of the closet. His slippers were still by the bed. His reading glasses were still on the nightstand, sitting on top of a book he never got to finish. "I really wish you'd called first," I said gently. His youngest son scoffed. "We don't need an appointment to go through our father's stuff." The word "our" stung. As if the man I had cared for, fed, bathed, and held for years wasn't part of my world too. I wanted to ask them for one more day. Maybe just one more evening to sit with his things quietly, to breathe him in before they tore through what little remained. But they were already walking down the hallway, opening doors, flipping on light switches, invading the space that had once been peaceful. I followed them slowly, feeling like a stranger in my own home. They started with his dresser drawers. His daughter pulled them open one by one, tossing shirts and socks onto the bed like she was sorting laundry. I stood in the doorway, twisting my hands together, trying not to crumble. "He kept everything so messy," she muttered. I almost laughed. "Charles? Messy?" The man folded his clothes the same way every time, 3 neat folds, collar facing up. He wasn't messy. Not ever. But she needed a reason to criticize, and grief made her bold. Then came the questions. What happened to his savings? Why aren't there more medical records? Where's the paperwork for his insurance policy? Did he give you access to his accounts? Why didn't you tell us he was this sick? Each question was sharper than the last, each one dripping with suggestion. Accusation. I answered calmly at first, explaining the medications, the bills, the routines we had. I explained the doctor visits. I explained the finances he had signed off on himself. I explained how often I had called them, invited them, encouraged them to be part of his care. But explanations mean nothing to people who came ready to blame. His eldest son stood in the doorway of Charles's study, arms crossed. "You handled everything conveniently." "Conveniently?" I repeated, stunned. He nodded slowly. "You were the only one here. You made all the decisions. You controlled everything." "I didn't control anything," I said, tears rising. "I cared for him. I did the work. I didn't want to be in charge. I wanted help." None of them spoke. None of them said thank you. None of them said sorry for not showing up. They moved on to the filing cabinet next, pulling out folders, shaking papers loose, whispering to each other in low tones they thought I couldn't hear. "She had access to this? Look at the date on that. She probably pressured him into something. I told you something was off." Something was off, all right, but not with me. After nearly 2 hours of tearing through his things, they found the folder. The will. I saw it in the eldest son's hand, the moment his eyes scanned the first page. His face went red, then white, then tight with anger. "What is this?" he asked, his voice trembling. "My husband's will," I answered quietly. "The one he updated a few years ago." His daughter snatched it from his hand, flipping through the pages like she expected to find a hidden trap. "Why would he do this?" she demanded. I breathed in.
Steady. Soft.
Because it's what he wanted. She shook her head so hard her earrings bounced. There's no way Dad left the house to you. My heart thumped painfully.
He did.
He talked to me about it many times. No, the eldest son snapped.
No.
This doesn't make sense. It makes perfect sense, I whispered. I lived here. I cared for him. This was our home. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't push back. I just stated the truth. And sometimes, truth is enough to make people furious. His youngest son pointed at me like I was a thief. So, you get everything? Just like that. I don't get everything, I said softly. Just the house. And only because he asked me to keep it. For what reason? The daughter demanded. For stability, I answered. He wanted to make sure I had a home. They didn't accept it. They couldn't. Because accepting it meant admitting they hadn't been there. That they didn't know their father well enough to understand what he valued. That the woman they dismissed for years had been the center of his life in his final days. They set the will down on the kitchen counter with a heavy smack, like it offended them just by existing. This isn't over, the eldest son said. We're not going to let you take what belongs to our family. I stood a little straighter. I didn't raise my voice, but my words came out steadier than I expected. Your father decided what belonged to him, and he made his choice. Silence filled the room for a moment. A tense, cold silence. Then the daughter stepped closer, tightening her jaw. We're going to talk to a lawyer. You can, I said. Everything is legal. Everything is documented. Everything was signed when he was fully aware. She glared at me like she wanted to burn me into the floor. His youngest son pushed open the back door, pacing on the porch. So what? She gets to live here forever? In our dad's house. Their father's house. Not mine. Not ours. His. Even after 15 years, they still couldn't see it as the home Charles and I made together. My home. Our home. I felt something inside me, something that had been tender and bleeding, slowly harden. They weren't here for memories. They weren't here for closure. They weren't even here for justice. They were here for possession, control, ownership, and they believed the easiest way to get it was by treating me like I didn't matter, like I didn't exist, like I wasn't the woman who had kissed their father's forehead every night, whispered encouragement into his ear, cleaned the wounds on his skin, and slept in a chair beside him for years. They wanted to erase that. Erase me. Erase everything he and I built together. But grief had carved out a new kind of strength in me, quiet, steady, thin as a thread but strong as steel. I looked at them one by one and said, I'm not leaving my home. The eldest son opened his mouth to argue, but I stepped forward just a bit. I know you're hurting. I know you wish things were different, but I did nothing wrong. Nothing. None of them responded. They gathered their things, slammed a few drawers shut, and walked toward the door. But before leaving, his daughter turned around one last time. Her voice was low, tight, trembling with anger she didn't try to hide. You won't win. I didn't say anything. Not because I didn't have anything to say, because I knew the fight wasn't about winning. It was about surviving. They left in a flurry of cold air and angry footsteps, leaving the house scattered with papers and memories. I stood alone in the quiet, the will still sitting open on the counter. I traced Charles's signature with my fingertip, feeling the weight of his trust settle over me like a warm coat. They thought they could force me out. They thought they could intimidate me. They thought they could rewrite the story. But they were wrong. This was only the beginning of the battle they were determined to start. And deep down, I knew the next storm was already on its way. In the days after they stormed out of my house, I tried to breathe in small, steady moments. I made tea. I sat on the edge of the bed where Charles used to sleep. I held his glasses in my hands and whispered to the quiet, I don't want a war. Please help me keep my peace. But peace doesn't come easy when people are determined to take it from you. It started with the phone calls. At first, they were spaced out 1 or 2 a day. Then it became 5, 6, 7 calls in an afternoon. Sometimes I picked up. Sometimes I let it ring while my heart pounded in my chest. His eldest son always spoke the same way, short, sharp, with a tone that made me feel like I was being scolded by someone who believed they were above me. "We need to review Dad's accounts. Why didn't you tell us about the medical expenses? Send us copies of his insurance. We think money is missing." Missing? I had receipts for every pill bottle, every doctor visit, every cream, brace, medication, and home care supply that kept Charles comfortable. I had spreadsheets and folders and bank statements all neatly filed because that was how I lived my life, organized, honest, trying my best. But honest people look suspicious to those who expect dishonesty. Each call chipped away at something fragile inside me. I tried to stay calm, answering with quiet patience. He spent a lot on treatments. "You're welcome to see the statements." He asked me to handle the bills. I kept everything documented. I didn't hide anything. I couldn't even if I wanted to. But each answer made them more hostile. His daughter once told me, voice trembling with anger, "You are just the wife. We're the blood." Just the wife. Funny how the title they weaponized was the same title their father chose for me, with love in his heart and tears in his eyes on our wedding day. A few days later, the threats began. "We're talking to a lawyer. You'll have to prove you didn't influence him. You could be in real trouble." Dad wasn't thinking clearly when he signed that will. That last one hurt the most. I sat down on the couch, holding the phone against my ear, staring at the empty recliner where Charles used to rest during long afternoons. "He was perfectly clear," I whispered. "He talked through everything with me. He made his decisions on his own." "No," his son said coldly. "You made them." The call ended. I sank into the cushions, feeling the whole room spin around me.
I didn't want this.
I didn't ask for this. All I wanted was to grieve in peace. But they weren't finished. The rumors came next. It started with a neighbor knocking on my door one morning. A sweet older man who had watched me take Charles on slow walks around the block, sometimes pushing his wheelchair, sometimes holding his hand when his legs trembled. His face was worried. "Are you all right?" he asked. I nodded. "Just tired." "Well," he hesitated. "I don't know if it's my place, but I heard something. One of his daughters was walking around the neighborhood yesterday, saying you kept Charles from his own family, that you took advantage of him, that maybe you weren't honest." The world tilted.
Me?
Dishonest? After 15 years of giving everything I had? I thanked the neighbor, closed the door gently, and leaned against it, sliding down until I was sitting on the floor. The tears came fast. It wasn't just the lies. It was the cruelty behind them. The deliberate choice to hurt me when I had done nothing but love a man they had long abandoned. Later that week, another neighbor made a comment at the grocery store. "Such a shame," she whispered, glancing at me with pity. "Family fights always get ugly. Uglier." This was only the beginning. The next attack hit even harder. One morning, I checked the joint medical account Charles and I had used for prescriptions and treatments. It wasn't a big account, just a place where we put aside small amounts for emergencies. It was nearly emptied. Transferred. I stared at the balance, my hands shaking. I went to the bank immediately, my breath tight, my chest hurting like I'd been punched. The teller looked up the account and said, "There was an access request from a family member. They closed the sub-account. Everything was moved. But that account was for his care," I whispered. "And he's gone." "I'm sorry," the teller said softly. "Legally, the children can access certain linked accounts unless there was a separate designation." I felt dizzy. There was. I set it up with Charles years ago. But grief makes you forget things. Stress makes you overlook signatures. Pain makes you vulnerable. His children knew the exact cracks in the system to slip through. I walked out of the bank feeling exposed and powerless. I stood in the parking lot with my purse hanging off one shoulder, staring at cars passing, people laughing, children tugging on their parents' hands. The world moved on while mine crumbled. For the first time in a long time, I felt old. Old in my bones. Old in my heart. Old in the places where hope usually lived. I went home, made myself a cup of tea, and sat at the kitchen table. The same table where Charles and I used to sit on Sunday mornings with biscuits and soft jazz music playing in the background. The chair across from me was empty. The house felt bigger than it ever had. Too big, too quiet, too hollow. I kept hearing the daughter's voice in my head. "You are just the wife." It echoed in the corners of the room, pushed in my ribs, seeped into my heart. I closed my eyes, held the warm mug with both hands, and let my shoulders shake with silent weeping. But something changed that afternoon. Something shifted inside me. At first it was small, just a whisper of a thought, soft and delicate. Then it grew stronger. Stronger than the pain. Stronger than the humiliation. Stronger than the fear. A voice inside me finally said, "Enough." Not loud. Not angry. Not violent. Just enough. I had spent years softening myself, gentling myself, lowering my voice to make room for theirs. I treated them with kindness even when they gave me coldness. I tried to share updates, include them, embrace them as family even when they kept me at arm's length. But grief clarifies. Cruelty clarifies. Abandonment clarifies. The woman who sat crying at the kitchen table wasn't weak. She was tired. She was cornered. She was done letting people who didn't love her run her life. The next day, when they called again, demanding a meeting to discuss removing you from the property, I didn't answer with tears or excuses. I answered with 7 quiet words. "You can speak with my attorney now." For a few seconds, there was silence. Real silence. Then a voice, one of the sons, growled, "You got a lawyer?" "No," I said. "Your father did, before he passed." It wasn't technically a lie. Charles had consulted his estate attorney years earlier, and I had just spoken to the same man yesterday. He left everything organized. I continued softly, "And I won't be bullied in the home we shared." The son snapped something angry and hung up. I placed the phone on the counter, inhaled deeply, and felt the tension in my chest loosen just a bit. It wasn't revenge. Not yet. But it was resistance. Over the next week, their calls grew quieter, then less frequent, then angrier again, then desperate. Their attorney finally reached out, polite, careful, clearly aware that the will was legitimate and airtight. "We advise your stepchildren to respect the wishes of the deceased," he said on a conference call. You could have heard a pin drop. His daughter exploded. "This isn't fair." He wasn't thinking straight. She manipulated him. I closed my eyes and let her words pass through me like cold wind. When she stopped shouting, the lawyer's voice came back, calm and strong. "There is no evidence of that. Everything is in order. Legally and ethically." Legally and ethically. 2 words that tasted like freedom. 2 words Charles would have been proud of. I didn't celebrate.
I didn't shout.
I didn't rub anything in. I simply thanked the lawyer and hung up. Later that evening, I walked into the living room and sat down in Charles's recliner, something I hadn't been able to do since he passed. It felt like sitting in memory and strength. The house was still mine. My dignity was still mine. And little by little, I was reclaiming pieces of myself I had forgotten in the months of fear and grief. But the fight wasn't fully over. Their bitterness wasn't gone. Their resentment wasn't quiet. I could feel another wave coming. Something bigger. Something more personal. Something meant to break me in places they hadn't reached yet. And I knew part 6 of my life would demand a strength I hadn't needed in years. After that call with the lawyer, something inside me finally settled. A heaviness that had been pressing against my ribs for months slowly loosened. It wasn't victory, not yet. It wasn't celebration. It was simply stillness. A kind of quiet I hadn't felt since before Charles got sick. A quiet that let me breathe without feeling like every breath might collapse under grief or fear or someone else's anger. I walked through the house that evening, my fingers brushing the walls, the picture frames, the furniture we'd chosen together. For the first time in a long time, the rooms didn't feel like battlegrounds. They felt like what they were supposed to be, mine. Not borrowed. Not threatened. Not waiting to be taken.
Mine.
But even as peace settled in, I knew better than to trust it completely. People who feel entitled to something rarely give up just because the law tells them they're wrong. And sure enough, they came back. Not with screaming or accusations this time. No banging on the door. No rummaging through drawers. This time, they came with politeness, forced, sharp-edged politeness. They wanted a conversation. I didn't invite them inside. I stepped out onto the porch instead, keeping the door slightly behind me, one hand resting on the frame. A small, steady reminder, to them and to myself, that this home was my final boundary. His daughter spoke first, rehearsed words flowing from tight lips. "We understand you're emotional right now," she began. "And maybe when things calm down, you'll see that selling this house is what Dad would have wanted." I stared at her. The same woman who had barely visited him, now speaking as if she knew his wishes better than the person who bathed him, fed him, comforted him, cried beside him. "I know exactly what he wanted," I said quietly, "because he told me, because he trusted me." She blinked. Her brother shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the street as if embarrassed to be there. Then came the real reason for their visit. "We don't want to involve courts," the son said, clearing his throat. "But we'd like some compensation."
For our time.
"For the estate. We think that's fair." Compensation. For the years I held Charles's trembling hands during bad nights. For the meals I cooked when he could barely swallow. For the nights I woke up at 3 a.m. to help him to the bathroom. For the savings I spent without hesitation. For the love I poured into a man they barely visited. His son's voice kept going, but I wasn't listening. Something inside me had finally clicked into place, so firm, so solid, it might as well have been poured in concrete. They didn't want justice. They wanted profit. And they believed I would fold. Because I was older. Because I was quiet. Because I had always tried to be kind. But kindness is not the same as weakness. And quiet is not the same as surrender. "I won't be giving you anything," I said gently. "Not money. Not this house. Not a single piece of the life I built with him." A long, heavy silence stretched between us. His daughter's face twisted with the same bitterness I'd seen when she found the will. "You'll regret this," she hissed. I shook my head. I stopped regretting things the day he took his last breath. They didn't understand what I meant. I didn't expect them to. Instead, they turned, walked down the porch steps, and drove away, slamming doors, tires squealing, pride bruised deeper than any wound I could have given them. I watched them go, not with anger, but with something close to relief. It was over. Not the grief. Not the memories. Not the strange ache that comes with waking up alone after years of being someone's whole world. But the war. The battle they demanded I fight. The conflict I never wanted. It was done. The next morning, I walked into Charles's study with a notebook in my hand and began organizing everything: the will, bank records, medical documents, my own financial information. Not because I needed to anymore, but because it felt like a ritual of reclaiming. A ritual of protection. A ritual of saying, "This is my life now. And no one is taking it from me." I sorted papers into labeled folders, placed them into a fireproof box, and stored it in a spot only I knew. Not out of fear, but out of wisdom. Life teaches you that protection is not paranoia, it is preparation. And once the paperwork was safe, I allowed myself something new. Rest. For weeks, months even, I had lived with tension sitting in my shoulders, in my jaw, in every muscle that tightened whenever the phone rang. Now, when I woke up in the morning, I didn't feel that immediate spike of dread. I felt sunlight through the curtains. I felt breath moving in and out of my chest. I felt my home as my home. I cleaned slowly, not because the house needed it, but because it soothed me. I cooked small meals again, simple ones, things Charles used to enjoy. I walked through the living room, dusted the picture frames, and even smiled at a memory or two. Life didn't snap back into place. It eased. Until one day, I stepped out onto the front porch and looked at the small patch of soil near the walkway, the one Charles had always talked about turning into a garden someday. "We'll plant marigolds," he once told me.
And rosemary.
"And maybe a little lavender so the whole yard smells like home." He'd say it during our evening tea, always with that little spark in his eyes that showed up whenever he imagined gentler things. I never had time to plan it. Caregiving took every ounce of me. Then grief took the rest. But now I could breathe. So I drove to the local nursery and bought a few small flower pots, a little scraggly but strong. I brought them home, set them in the soil, and knelt down with a small trowel. As I dug into the earth, turning it over with slow, steady motions, something inside me softened. Planting those flowers wasn't just gardening. It was reclaiming time. It was honoring Charles. It was choosing growth after months of being clawed at by people who wanted only to take. By the time I finished, the sun was dipping low, painting the sky in soft gold and lavender. I sat back on the porch steps, wiped my hands on my jeans, and looked at what I'd made. A simple garden, small and quiet. Nothing dramatic. Nothing extravagant. Just life beginning again. A quiet life. A steady life. A life that belonged to me. My revenge wasn't slamming doors or screaming or throwing people out. It wasn't lawsuits or custody battles over belongings they didn't even care about. My revenge was staying. Staying in the home they tried to rip away. Staying true to the love I shared with Charles. Staying strong in ways they never expected. Staying rooted in a peace they could never understand. They had spent so much time trying to push me out that they never noticed the truth. I wasn't going anywhere. This home held my memories, my late-night confessions with Charles, our quiet jokes, our shared fears, our deep tenderness. They had no power to erase that. They had no right to rewrite a story they barely showed up for. And slowly, beautifully, the house began to feel warm again. I started attending small community events. I joined a knitting circle at the local library. I volunteered at the senior center on weekends. I made friends, gentle, kind people who asked how I was doing and actually meant it. I laughed again. Softly at first. Then freely. I began to feel like myself, not the caregiver fighting battles, not the widow defending her home, not the woman cornered by cruelty, but the woman Charles loved. The woman he trusted. The woman he left this house to because he knew she would protect it, cherish it, live in it. And I did. One quiet afternoon, months later, I stood in the doorway of the living room, watching sunlight fall across the hardwood floor, and I felt something I never expected to feel again. Home. Not a place under threat. Not a place filled with someone else's anger. Not a place haunted by fear. Just home. A life built on my own terms. A future shaped by my own choices. A peace earned through storms. A strength I didn't know I still had. If you had asked me back then what revenge looks like, I might have said it was about getting even, proving them wrong, fighting loud and fierce. But life taught me better. Revenge, real revenge, is not anger. It's not destruction. It's not matching cruelty with cruelty. Real revenge is living well. It's protecting your dignity when others try to strip it away. It's standing tall when they expect you to crumble. It's choosing peace over chaos. It's keeping a home you earned when everyone tried to steal it. It's planting flowers in the soil they hoped would bury you. Today, when I look at my little garden blooming near the walkway, I don't think about their threats or their insults or their greed. I think about how far I've come. I think about the woman I am now, steady, rooted, whole. Charles would have smiled at those flowers. And I think he would have smiled at me too. Thank you for listening to my story. If this story resonated with you, leave a like and consider subscribing. You can also drop any comment below, even just one word. Maybe tell me where you're watching from or what time it is right now. Sometimes one word is enough to say you were here.